Hello, everyone. How are you doing today? What's new? How is everyone doing? What's new in your world? It's a lovely afternoon. I'm sitting here in front of my bookshelf. Let me get a little more centered there. I'm sitting in front of my bookshelf. I've got plenty of unnamed diet beverage. It's Saturday afternoon. It's just like the good old days, right? Before the plague, before the pandemic, before this country went completely bonkers. Here we are. Here we are. It is Saturday afternoon, and we've got plenty of things to talk about. What condition is U.S. President Donald Trump in? What condition is he in? I mean, some people say he's doing really well with his COVID. Some people say he's doing really badly. No one can make up their minds, right? We don't really know. He's walled off in a military hospital, and we have no idea how Donald Trump is doing. We have no idea what will happen with this second debate or this third debate. We have no idea if he will live until the election. We have no clue. So all we can do is sit back and enjoy the show and hope that the pandemic ends soon. I wonder if I can. Nah. I like these Mandarin collars. They call this a Mandarin collar after China. A Mandarin collar. I like Mandarin collars. They're really nifty. And so I thought I would wear one. For work, I need to wear a tie. They don't exactly work with a tie. So I thought I would throw one on this afternoon. But folks, if you're just joining us now, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Hit the notifications bell so that you'll get notified when it's time for us to do another one of these lives. Be part of this community. I'm sitting here. I'm happy to answer your questions. I feel like we're a little community here, right? A little later in the show, we'll do what we always do. We'll do that roll call where I call your names and locations as I see you, and I'll be disappointed. There'll be names that if I don't get to call them out, I'll be disappointed because I call them out every time I'm on here, right? Good, loyal members of this community. I see some of you writing in the chat right now, and if I didn't see your name in the roll call, I would be disappointed because what we're doing here is very, very, very special. Especially during this pandemic time when there's been so much insanity. I mean, doing these lives has been so important. It's been a way to keep things going between these lives that I've been doing. I've been doing a lot more of them than I used to, as you folks will notice. I've also been working out a lot more, going to the gym. I went to the gym this morning. I did a little bit on the treadmill, got my heart rate up, lifted some weights, then got on a bike and did a little bit of a cool down on a bike. It's been fun. We're all just trying to entertain ourselves. Someone says, when is Caleb going to wear a Sun Yat-sen suit? I don't own one. If you know where I could buy a Sun Yat-sen suit, I might wear one. Now, some might not consider it appropriate for me to wear such a thing. They might consider it to be cultural appropriation. I had a friend who got married in a Sun Yat-sen suit, actually. Went to a wedding, a friend of mine in New Jersey. He got married, and he got married to another friend of mine, female, heterosexual marriage. And, we went to a nice park. I remember a nice park, and my friend was wearing his Dr. Sun Yat-sen suit. My other friend was wearing a traditional Chinese dress. They got married, and they actually moved to China. And what was weird was this couple, I'd known them for years. They'd been dating for years. I'd known them. They lived with me for a while, roommates. They'd been saying, we're going to move to China. We're going to move to China. And nobody ever thought they were serious, right? People always say that. We're going to move to China. They got married. They had this wedding in which he wore a Chinese outfit and she wore a Chinese outfit. And they kept saying, we're going to move to China. A year went by after the wedding. We're going to move to China. Another year went by after the wedding. They said, we're going to move to China. And then they called me up and they said, we're moving to China. And I was like, wait, for real? And they're like, for real. Went out and visited them one time. They said it's really happening. And they've been in China ever since. I like it when people do what they say they're going to do. I've always liked that. I don't like it when people talk about doing something and never actually do it. But I like it when people make a plan and implement it. President Xi Jinping, he famously said, "The worth of any plan is in its implementation." The worth of any plan is in its implementation. And that is totally true. That is totally true. I've never understood this. I've known so many people that they say, oh, we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and they don't do it. And they say, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. They spend the whole day dreaming up this thing, and they never do it. And I don't get it. I just don't get it. I've never understood why people would make plans that they have no intention of carrying it out. If in the course of making the plan you discover that something about the plan is unworkable, then you should make another plan. You know, that's been my feeling. You know, and there's something fulfilling about fulfilling a plan, right? When you make a plan and you carry it out, it's fulfilling. It gives you this feeling of having control over your life, right? It gives you this feeling of being in charge, right? You know, that's one of the weird things about, you know, when people struggle with addiction. What they're struggling with, it's not that they do something bad or whatever, or they do something that's bad for their health or whatever. It's that they feel they have no control over it, right? That's what's the root of addiction. If someone says, I'm not going to do something, and they're unable to make themselves not do it, right? That is the essence of what an addiction is. It's when a person in their heart, major BOP, walk right. All right. Healthcare. Finally. You know, they don't have the ability to actually make themselves do something. They've lost the willpower, the ability to overcome, right? And that is the essence of addiction. And those who struggle with addiction, they're struggling to regain their self-control, right? There's a lot written about the concept of grit, G-R-I-T, grit, right? It's your ability to endure, your ability to keep going despite opposition. I think grit is very, very important. Your ability to force yourself to continue going. You know, I tell people I used to run cross country when I was in the junior high. When I was in 7th and 8th grade, I ran cross country. And, you know, we had 2-mile races. I think when you get to high school, you know, cross country running is 3.2 miles. When you were in junior high, it's a 2-mile race. And I remember that I was particularly good at cross country. I mean, I wasn't like the best. You know, I'm not a natural athlete. I don't have an athletic body. But you know, I was good at cross country because every day after school we'd run 2 miles, we'd run 4 miles. And so then, you know, we'd have our cross country meet. There'd be other schools there. There'd be another school, and there'd be us, and we would have this course, this 2-mile course through the woods and, you know, around buildings and, you know, on the street, you know, cross country, different terrain. We would run our 2-mile course. And when I would get to the point that I could see the finish line, when I could see the finish line at the end of the race, and I knew I could see in my eyes where the finish line was, at that point I would think, okay, any energy I have left after the finish line doesn't really do me any good now, does it? Right? I don't need to preserve any strength, any energy for the post-finish line portion of this race. So it's time to let everything go. It's time to kick it. It's time to just give it everything you've got. And I remember I would see that finish line. At the end of the race, I would pass 10, 15 people. Right? I never won. I was never like an expert. Expert, what is that? I mean, I was never a star athlete. I was never very good at it. But I always surprised people with the end of the race, right? Because when I saw the finish line, I would just give it everything I had, just everything. And you would feel the moisture in your body all just go up into your chest, right? And you would just keep running like nothing, like your life depended on it. Just go, just give it everything you had. You just packed it all into that last little bit in the race. You just surged in that final moment. You just packed every ounce of energy you had into getting from the moment you saw the finish line to the finish line. And you surged ahead and get to the finish line. And I would pass 10, 15 people, and the crowd would just be shaking. Like, where did he get that strength? And I would just be, just flexing, just enduring until I got to the finish line. I would get to the finish line, and often I would vomit when I got to the finish line. I would cross that line. They would stop the stopwatch, and I would try and slow down. In some cases, I would vomit. Many times I did vomit at the end. But if I vomited at the end of the finish line, that meant I had given it my all. I had actually endured, that was what I liked about cross-country running. It was a test not of it's not like sprinting, right? It's a test of endurance. That's what cross-country running is. It's a test of endurance. It's your ability to endure. It is your ability to endure. That's what cross-country running is. And if you've ever done it, you'll understand that. You'll understand that. And I guess that points to why goalposts are important in life, why markers are important in life, why finish lines are important in life, right? If you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, you can endure the darkness. If you can start to see the first ray of dawn come up, you can get through the rest of the night. People really value the ability to know that whatever suffering they currently face will reach its end, and that their pain will be relieved, and that things will once again be right. People value that, right? When I was in the Islamic Republic of Iran, one of the places they took me to was the shrine of Imam Mahdi. Now, those who are not familiar with the Islamic tradition won't really know much about this, and those who are probably will. So I will explain this. And I was not and am not a Muslim, so they had to explain it to me. So forgive me if there are those who are really, really well knowledgeable about Islamic theology, Islamic scholarship. They will probably be able to answer this way better than I can as a non-Muslim. I will explain to the best of my ability what Imam Mahdi is. Right? The idea is that at the end of time, there is some kind of angel that will return to earth with Jesus. Jesus will have his second coming, but Muslims believe that along with Jesus will come this angel, the angel that comes at the end of time. However, Shia Muslims, right, not Sunni, but Shia Muslims have a little bit of a different theological interpretation. The 12er Shia Muslims, what the difference between a Sunni and a Sunni does not recognize any imams as successors to the Prophet Muhammad. However, Shia Muslims recognize imams that come after the Prophet Muhammad, right? The Alawites recognize Imam Ali, right? The Zaydis, those are the Houthis in Yemen, they recognize all the way up to Imam Zayd, right? But most Shia Muslims in the world are what you would call Twelvers. That's what the Twelver form of Shia. And they believe that there is 12 imams that come after the Prophet Muhammad, and that the 12th imam was called the Imam Mahdi, or Imam Mahdi, right? Depends the pronunciation, Arabic, different dialects or whatever. And that this imam, he was a young boy. He was like 12 years old, and he went away. And he just vanished, got lost, disappeared. And that he is Imam Mahdi. And that instead of some angel returning at the end of time, it's actually the 12th Imam. And that he is always present among us. Under every generation, he's somewhere. But at the end of time, he reveals himself and brings justice to the world. The 12th Imam. That is the teaching of the Shia tradition. And that the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, is the bringer of justice. He comes to make all right in the world. At the time of the Islamic Revolution, many of the supporters of Khomeini believed Khomeini was the Mahdi. However, when Khomeini died, it became clear he was not the Mahdi. But at the time, there were many who believed that the Islamic Revolution and the rise of Khomeini indicated that Khomeini was the Mahdi, right? And there have been various Shia religious figures. There was, I believe, a figure in Sudan, who claimed to be the Mahdi. And it is just part of the Shia religious tradition. They believe that there is this special moment that will come when the 12th Imam will reveal himself. That is the theology there of Shia Islam. And when I was in Iran, they took me to the shrine of Imam Mahdi in Tehran. And I was in a room packed full of young men, and they had one singer. They have these religious singers who sing into the microphone, and he was leading the crowd in singing and clapping some of these traditional Shia songs. These songs were very, very lively. They would, there's one song where they just repeat the name Ali over and over again. Ali, 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 in honor of Imam Ali. And it's a very, very emotional moment. It's men only in the room. The rooms are so hot, packed full of people, young men sweating, just sweat pouring down people's faces. But it's also very, very emotional, right? The songs are very, very emotional. They tend to be about death and martyrdom and sacrifice. There's a lot of crying. There's a lot of heavy emotions going on. It was quite an experience to be in the shrine of Imam Mahdi. And outside the shrine of Imam Mahdi, they actually have there's a graveyard there, right? And it's in this particular graveyard that the scientists, the nuclear scientists who were running Iran's nuclear power plants, nuclear energy program, right, had nothing to do with nuclear weapons, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency confirms. They never did anything to try and get nuclear weapons. But the scientists who were associated with Iran's peaceful nuclear energy program, who were assassinated, who were killed, those scientists, they're buried near the Mahdi shrine. And their graves are there, and they are especially honored. And I visited the graves of these 4 nuclear scientists who were killed. And they were just scientists. One of them was a professor. He taught physics at an Iranian university. And as he was walking to class one day, they blew him away. Somebody killed him. It was awful. These guys had wives, they had kids, and they were just doing peaceful nuclear energy. But we found out that it was the Israeli government, Mossad, in coordination with the terrorist organization called the Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK or MKO, Bezos, Soros, BLM. Okay. Okay. That killed these scientists. Just horrible stuff. Just absolutely horrendous. Now, in Iran they do have the death penalty. They use the death penalty there pretty liberally. And actually, one thing I was told by my guides is they did catch one individual who was tried and convicted for being part of the assassination conspiracy of these nuclear scientists. And so they hanged him, and they made a point of hanging him at the very site where one of these scientists was killed. And so I remember my guides telling me, well, this is where the killing happened, and showing me where the killing happened, and they said, and this is where they hung the guy who was convicted of being part of the conspiracy to kill these nuclear scientists. I guess, they hung this guy on a crane, right? They brought a crane, like a construction crane over, and this guy had been charged with, and convicted of being part of the conspiracy to assassinate these 4 peaceful nuclear scientists, and they hung him on a crane, and a whole crowd of people gathered and watched this guy get hung on a crane. Pretty wild stuff. Pretty wild stuff. Pretty wild stuff. I don't know why I ended up talking about Iran. First I was talking about cross-country running, and then I was talking about Shia Islam and Iran, and now I'm talking about all kinds of stuff. But hey, folks, you just got to talk about your experiences. Right? What else can you do? If you haven't done so already, tweet this out, share this, make this a bigger conversation. We want more people here. Put this on Reddit, put this on Facebook as your status, put this on Twitter. Bring people along. I always love to talk with people. This is my Saturday afternoon hangout, right? We only have outdoor seating at restaurants here in New York City these days. There are no late night parties. There are no political gatherings of any kind. So, ask them. Ask them. I don't want to ask them. I've interviewed people from that organization before. Talk to them about it. I don't want to speak for them. Yeah, I mean, we're talking here. Right now, it's up in the air. Everything's up in the air. First debate happens, then Donald Trump, goes and, is tested positive for COVID, and Michael Moore has a meltdown on social media and says that this is Donald Trump faking it, and all kinds of things are happening. All kinds of things are happening, and at times like this, it's good to talk about what you know. Now, don't talk about things that you don't know. Talk about things that you actually know. Right? Talk about things that you actually know. One thing I know is that socialism works. That's one thing I know very, very, very well. Right? I've been to Venezuela. Venezuela, the backbone of the revolution in Venezuela is these things called collectivos, which are like cooperatives, right? They're little like socialist commune cooperative places in the middle of Venezuela. And they're kind of the backbone of the revolution. And in central Caracas and a lot of the working class neighborhoods there, you have these collectivos, right? There's different ones. They're centered around different people. There's one that's associated with the Communist Party. There's one that's associated with more of a Christian, revolutionary kind of thing. We visited a number of these collectivos, and it was very interesting to talk to the people there because they are the ideological backbone of the Bolivarian movement and of Bolivarian socialism. I mean, those folks, they're the ones who make it happen, and they have a lot of like radio stations where they broadcast, revolutionary messages to the rest of Venezuela. They live together in these communes. They give classes and training to people. They have cooperatively owned businesses, and they are the backbone, right? The backbone of the Chavista Bolivarian movement. One thing I do remember is I remember we met at one particular collectivo. We talked with a young woman, and she's the director of security at the collectivo. She was in her early 20s. She wore army pants, and we got to know her life story. Fascinating story. So I guess she was a homeless child in Venezuela. She was wandering the streets as a homeless child. And she did not speak Spanish. She spoke only an indigenous language. Um, and she was a homeless child. And that happened, right? In the 1990s, there were many, many indigenous people throughout Venezuela who lost their land. They were driven off their land and ended up, coming to the urban centers, desperately poor, right? Neoliberalism, free market economics was imposed on Venezuela by the IMF and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization during the 1990s. The U.S. regime, just allowed Venezuela to be looted by the big banks and international corporations. They cut public services. In some of the cities, the electricity wouldn't go on for weeks, and they would have to have a strike, in order to get the electricity to come back on. The garbage wouldn't be collected. The IMF, the World Bank, were always demanding that they cut the budget, right? And on top of that, a lot of indigenous people were being driven off their land, and it was just a bad situation in Venezuela in the 1990s. And she was an indigenous child, right? And she ended up in Caracas, the capital, and she was, an orphan child, just kind of wandering around and did not speak Spanish, but she ended up being taken to an orphanage that was run by a socialist, communist priest. There's a Roman Catholic priest in Venezuela who was a liberation theology, kind of guy, and he ran this orphanage. And so she ended up growing up in this socialist orphanage, yeah, and eventually the Catholic priest that she was taken in by started a collectivo, and she became one of the youth activists who was very much in support of Hugo Chavez. She talked about how she feels like there's a whole generation of Venezuelans who are Chavez children, right? They would watch Chavez TV program, Allo Presidente, every Sunday. They would read the books that he told them to read, right? Like Chavez would assign books to his viewers, right? What Trump does with Twitter is kind of inspired, many people think, by kind of what Hugo Chavez did with his TV program, where he would just talk to the Venezuelan people every day or every Sunday at least on TV and take their phone calls, and it was something going on, and she watched him, and he would tell them to read Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. He would tell them to read the Communist Manifesto. He would tell them to read they would tell them to read the various Marxist books and such, and they would read them and study them, and they were educated by Hugo Chavez. And Open Veins of Latin America, that's another book he really pushed. It was a whole generation of young people. And then you'll recall, that there was an attempted coup in 2002 against Chavez that was defeated. Chavez announced Venezuela was moving toward 21st century socialism. And this woman had grown up with all of this, right? She had grown up with all of this, right? Grown up through it, up into her adulthood, being part of the Chavista movement. And she said that she is religious, and she believes that God assigned her, gave her the purpose of dying for the Bolivarian Revolution, and that is her purpose on this earth, is to die for Bolivarian socialism. That was quite a moving presentation to hear, right? To hear this story. But if you go through Caracas, through Venezuela, through the neighborhoods, you'll see big posters of Che Guevara. You'll see big posters of Fidel Castro. You'll see big posters of Maduro. You'll see big posters of Lenin and Stalin. You'll see whole neighborhoods where they are, tips for debating anarchists. You'll see whole neighborhoods where the people are loyal and they are dedicated, revolutionaries, and they are not going to surrender. And I've seen that, right? And as hard as things were in Venezuela in recent years, they've certainly started to improve, but they were quite difficult in the past couple of years. As hard as they are, there's a core of people in Venezuela who ain't going back. They actually have a t-shirt, a slogan, "We won't go back." And they ain't going back. They ain't going back. There's a core of people there in Venezuela. There's this army of working class people who would never have been able to see a doctor if it hadn't been for socialism, would never have the homes they live in, right? They got an interest-free loan from the government to build their homes. They would never have homes to live in, that weren't, they would never have modern housing, let me put it that way. They would never have been able to see a doctor if it weren't for Chavez bringing in the Cuban doctors. They may not even be literate if it weren't for Chavez wiping out illiteracy in Venezuela. And that solid core of people, right? That solid core of people, come hell and high water, they're diehard communists. They ain't going anywhere. Now, there was an attempted coup. There's been many attempted coups against Chavez. And there's one neighborhood in Venezuela. And it was revealed that the coup plotters, part of their plan wasn't just to remove Hugo Chavez from the presidency. Part of their plan was to firebomb the pro-communist neighborhoods in the capital, in Caracas, because they knew that those people will never back away. So the plan was to just firebomb these whole neighborhoods and kill all these pro-Chavista people because they are the core of the movement. There's a book called "We Created Chavez," which is pretty good, and it goes into describing the collectivos and the communes and the movement that really brought Hugo Chavez and Maduro to power. You can read about it. It's very fascinating stuff. I mean, I've been there, I've seen it, right? I'll tell you. I've repeated this story before. I'll say it again. I went to Ecuador when I was a kid. I was 12 years old, and my dad, something related to his job, he was there. Okay, Bothus. My dad was actually leading nature tours in the Galapagos Islands. That's like a side gig my dad did for a living, is he would lead nature tours. And he was leading nature tours in the Galapagos Islands. And so, I went along with my dad, right? And I remember we went to Quito, Ecuador. And when we arrived in Quito, Ecuador, outside the airport, there was just crowds and crowds of desperately poor, starving people. Desperately poor, desperately impoverished, starving people. And the reason that they were there, this was 1999, was because under neoliberalism, under free market capitalism, the economy of Ecuador had just been destroyed. They'd been forced to adopt the US dollar as their currency. They had been, the crops had failed because of El Nino and some of the climate change, problems. On top of that, they had been forced to enact all kinds of crazy free market reforms, and the Asian markets had crashed, and all of a sudden there was just mass starvation and death in Ecuador caused by capitalism. I saw that poverty. Well, I went back to Ecuador in 2013, the year of 2013, when I was a communist activist for the World Festival of Youth and Students, which is a gathering of communists every 4 years. And what I saw after the leadership of Rafael Correa, after Ecuador had begun moving toward Bolivarian socialism, was night and day. I mean, it was a different country. I mean, the roads were paved. I didn't see homeless people everywhere. It was in a totally new country. And there was a lot of Chinese stuff everywhere. I remember that. I remember seeing, we'd go down the highway and there were all these signs advertising Chinese car dealerships, Chinese cars. A lot of Ecuadorians have Chinese cars. And the signs, they just said in Spanish, it was one word, it was Asian car. Asian car. All right. Peaceful revolutions. Okay. All righty. But yeah, I've seen it, folks. The influence. I've never been to China, but the influence that China has, the strength of China economically, all over Latin America, China, all over Iran and the Middle East, China. Brazil. I went to Brazil, China. All over Russia, I see China, right? China's economic influence is massive. Massive. This country used to be the sick man of Asia. There's no doubt in my mind that socialism works, right? And that's why it annoys me to hear people go, oh, communism's failed everywhere it's ever been tried. No, no, no. No, it hasn't, right? Look at Cuba, right? Compare Cuba's influence around the world to any other island of that size. To any other, previously impoverished country, right? Compare Cuba to the Dominican Republic. Compare Cuba to Haiti. Compare Cuba to Jamaica, and you'll find that the life expectancy is much longer. People are living far better. These folks, they just repeat this. Communism's failed everywhere it's ever been tried. It's not true. It's not actually factually accurate. What about the fact that everywhere communism's ever been tried, it's never worked? False. Wrong. Communism turned China into a global superpower. Communism turned Russia into a global superpower. The achievements of Cuba, all the people that I saw that were raised out of poverty in Venezuela, all the people that I saw that were raised out of poverty in Ecuador. These people who say this, it's just like there are some things that are true in this world. There are some things that are not. And communism's failed everywhere it's ever been tried is not true. It's just not true. It's not true. Communism had problems everywhere it's ever been tried. You betcha it did. Communism involved political repression. That's true. Communism has had to adjust itself, right? The Soviet Union fell. There are true things you can say, but saying communism has just been a complete and utter failure everywhere it's ever been tried, that is a false statement. But people go around saying it. People believe it. People really, really believe it. And it's not just right-wingers who believe this. DSA believes this, right? They walk around, we're for Norway and Sweden. Yeah, every time they've tried to have real communism, it's failed everyone. No, wrong, right? And how do I know? Is mistreating me? Interesting question. But at the end of the day, all right, communism has been highly successful. Meanwhile, capitalism is crashing and burning. Capitalism's crashing and burning. It's falling apart before our very eyes. Can't handle situations like pandemics. Can't handle the problems around the environment and needing to get control of emissions, global warming. Can't handle making sure people have education. Can't handle making sure people have health care. Capitalism is a failing system, right? Basic economic data, folks. Basic economic data. What was the greatest period? This is something, you can use this, right? The next time somebody says, oh, we need real capitalism. Just ask them this question. This is basic economics 101. What was the greatest period of economic growth in all of human history? What was the largest period of economic growth? What was the most massive moment of economic growth in all of human history? Just ask the question. What was the greatest moment of economic growth in all of human history? What was it? Well, they won't know because that's like economic data. But every economist, it is an undisputed fact that there has never been more economic growth than there was in the post-World War II economic expansion, 1951 to 1971. 20 years, the post-World War II economic expansion. That was the greatest period of economic growth in all of human history, was the post-World War II economic expansion. At no other point in human history has there been that much economic growth. And in this greatest period of economic expansion in all of human history, laissez-faire, free market, libertarian economics was nowhere to be found. Nowhere. 1950 to 1970, or 1951 to 1971. That's the time we're talking about, which every economist agrees was the greatest period of economic expansion in all of human history. 1951, 1971. That was the height of strength of global communism, number one. Right? Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, were all building socialism. Number two, that was the height of the Keynesian welfare state in Europe. So France and Germany and Sweden and Norway and Britain and Italy and all of them were giving people free healthcare and free education and spending government money. So in the communist world, you have communism. In the Western European world, you have the Keynesian welfare state. Plus, that was also the heyday of Bonapartist regimes, military strongmen in the third world, right? You have the Shah of Iran, you have Park Chung-hee in South Korea, you've got various, Peronist regimes and military juntas throughout South America that are, nowhere in the world in that time do you find anybody doing the stupid free market malarkey. All right? The greatest period of economic expansion in all of human history, 1951, 1971. You can Google it right now. Post-World War II economic expansion. If capitalism leads to economic growth, if deregulation works, if libertarian economics is the answer, then that should have been the most libertarian time in all of human history, right? It should have been like, there should have been just libertarianism all from sea to shining sea, all across the world. This should have been deregulated capitalism, because capitalism equals economic growth. Wrong. The greatest period of economic expansion in human history was the strongest moment for world communism. Right? That was the moment when world communism had the most influence around the world. The most countries around the world were building socialism, number one. Number two, it was the strongest moment for the Keynesian welfare state, right? The Keynesian welfare state, the social democracy stuff in Western Europe was the strongest it had ever been. Plus, in the third world, among the pro-Western regimes, it was the period where strongman military juntas were directing the economy, and you had like military, Keynesian Bonapartist regimes in the third world. So all this economic growth is happening at a time where the system that they claim is the only system that has ever raised anyone out of poverty, the only system that has ever created economic growth. They say this all the time. Oh, only capitalism's ever raised people out of poverty. Wrong. Only capitalism, only free market capitalism's ever lifted people and created economic growth. Wrong, right? The post-World War II economic expansion was the period where communism has never been as strong as it was coming out of World War II. Social democracy has never been as strong as it was coming out of World War II. And in the third world, in the pro-US camp, Bonapartist, Dergist, whatever you want to call them, military strongmen, right? All this economic growth is happening, and libertarianism is nowhere. What happens, right? So as the post-World War II economic expansion comes to an end, 1971, you have the Nixon shocks. 1973, you have the Gulf oil crisis or whatever. So it's like early 70s, it comes to an end. What happens in the early 70s? 1973, what happens? The first major libertarian, would you agree the disaster of U.S. politics is, yeah, all right. Yes, I would, but we'll talk about that, David. Disaster. U.S. politics, disaster of capitalism. What happens in 1973? 1973 is the year that Salvador Allende, the elected Marxist president of Chile, was toppled in a coup. And the first major libertarian social experiment of the 20th century is put into practice. What the British Empire did in India, during the 1800s, what the British Empire did in China during the 1800s, what the British Empire spent the entire 1800s doing, basically. 1973, in the name of rebranded as libertarianism, Adam Smith economics is forced on Chile at the barrel of a gun. And it demolished their economy. I mean, it demolished their economy. 1973, Pinochet comes in, gets rid of the food subsidies. So all over Chile, children are fainting in class because they don't have enough food because they're malnourished, right? A whole lot of children become mentally disabled because they didn't have enough food because the food subsidies were cut off. The average Chilean family is spending like 70% of their income on only food. Meanwhile, their domestic industries are put out of business, basically, and American Telecom takes over the country. Their local telecom companies are chucked. Their local mining companies are chucked. Their domestic industries are completely ruined. It was an economic disaster. I mean, the actual results of what Milton Friedman did in Chile were an economic disaster. Now, they always talk about, well, what about the Chilean economic miracle? Well, 1973 is when Pinochet came in, and 1973 is when he brought the Chicago boys, Chicago School of Economics, to Chile. The Chilean economic miracle is in 1981. A lot of things happened between 1973 and 1981. And in 1981, the Pinochet government started renationalizing things and started completely reorienting itself politically because the country was in economic ruin. So the Chilean economic miracle actually happened after they abandoned libertarianism to try and stabilize the country. So that's a bunch of malarkey, right? Another libertarian free market experiment, the fall of the Soviet Union, right? Again, right? Communism never worked anywhere, but capitalism is the only system. Oh, okay. So when capitalism was imposed on the former Eastern Bloc and on the former Soviet Union, right? Communism leads to poverty. They tell us capitalism makes people rich. Capitalism makes countries prosperous. So in the 1990s, when they adopted free market economics all across Russia and the former Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, they should have all just gotten really, really rich. That's how it works, right? According to them, communism makes you poor, capitalism makes you rich. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, they had communism. So they must have been just dirt poor before. They weren't. That's a whole other story. But then in the 1990s, they should have just gotten really, really rich because they had free market capitalism. Wrong again. Right? The 1990s was an absolute disaster in Eastern Europe. It was a disaster in Russia. Huge rise in child sex trafficking, huge rise in unemployment, 20 to 30% unemployment, heroin addiction, all the food system just completely fell apart, and they had to start importing all their food from the United States. The 1990s in Russia, the 1990s in Eastern Europe is a disaster. And how did things get better? When Putin came in and he put public control over oil and gas, created two state-controlled mega corporations, Gazprom and Rosneft, and centered the economy once again around government-controlled industries, and asserted now basically in Russia, they have these two mega corporations, Gazprom and Rosneft. They sell energy and oil and gas all over the world, and the state has the money, and the state uses the money to subsidize things like farming, right? They're having record wheat production right now. They're farming, and their agriculture is just through the roof now because of a state central planning. They have manufacturing, mining, etc. So the way that they fixed the economy was by reasserting state control. Libertarianism, free market economics, that we have been taught all our lives in the United States is the only way things ever work, has been a complete and utter failure. The history of the last 100 years utterly confirms this. Russia and China had free market capitalism imposed on it at the barrel of a gun by the British Empire, and millions of people starved to death all the time. Then China broke out of that system, and it started building itself up, and now China is the second largest economy in the world, right? Russia broke out of the domination of Western capitalism, and it made itself into a global superpower. I mean, I mean, it's just like the history of the 20th century. The fall of the Soviet Union was an utter disaster. It was fixed by the reassertion of state control. I mean, the imposition of free markets was a disaster all across South America in the 1980s and 90s. And Bolivarianism raised millions of people out of poverty, fixing it with state central planning and socialism. Everywhere you go, free market libertarianism fails, and socialism has successes. Does that mean that never has capitalism done anything good? Of course, there have been, examples of capitalism doing things well. Does that mean that that socialism never has any problems? Of course not. There are big problems in every socialist country. But the economic record speaks for itself. Socialism works. Free market capitalism does not. This is just basic facts, folks. This is just basic economic data. I'm not saying anything here that most people who know anything about economic statistics wouldn't confirm. This is just basic stuff. But it's like the elephant in the room. You're not allowed to say it. Right? If you were an economics professor at a university and you said this, you'd lose your job. Right? I mean, this is like, they report you're a Stalin apologist, right? It's like people, I mean, meanwhile, there's a guy on PragerU who teaches at Hillsdale College, I believe, Hillsdale University. And he gets on there and he says things that are so ridiculous in his PragerU video. He says things like, well, the book Capital by Karl Marx has no data in it. I think it does. I think it's got a little bit of data in there. Have you ever looked at the book Capital by Karl Marx? Pretty big book, a lot of data. What was Karl Marx doing in the British Museum all that time? But this guy's supposed to be a professor, and he says, well, the book Capital by Marx has no data in it. I mean, it's like, there you go. And he says, everywhere that communism has ever been implemented, it made life worse by a lot. Really? So, like, giving literacy to the whole country in the Soviet Union, electrifying the whole place, bringing people running water, almost doubling the life expectancy. But no, I mean, just made life worse because that's what everyone knows. It's true because everyone knows it, and everyone knows it because it's true. I mean, it's just, there's no thoughts, right? And then social democrats go along with this. Social democrats, someone says to a social democrat or to an anarchist or to a Trotskyite, it says to them, hey, communism failed everywhere it's ever been tried. And they say, yeah, that's okay, but we have a different kind of communism. It's like, oh, okay. All right. Well, at that point, just give up. Right? I will say that the right wing's argument against socialism and communism, it's a correct argument, logically speaking. It's just not based on true information. The right wing, constantly, they say, everywhere communism's ever been tried, it's resulted in mass death, poverty, and only made life worse. False. But if that were true, the argument goes on, that this is what's happened, so why would we ever want to try it again? Their logic is correct, right? If in every country that had ever had socialism, we're talking Soviet Union, China, Cuba, Libya, Venezuela, Bolivia, every country ever, North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Yemen, the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, Zimbabwe, if every country that had ever had socialism had never had any economic success, then they would be right. It just so happens they're not right. It just so happens that socialism has raised millions of people out of poverty. It just so happens that socialism has had tremendous, astounding economic successes. Now, I see stuff going by in the chat, and I don't know if people are trolling me or not. So, until I get some confirmation, I'm not going to report anything. I have heard, anyway. But folks, well, I'm glad you like my haircut, Pony Panda. I'm glad you like my haircut. Folks, socialism has been overwhelmingly successful. It is a successful system. Um, Capitalism, meanwhile, is having all kinds of problems. And basic overview of basic economic data confirms that. It's the elephant in the room. You're not allowed to say that. You're not allowed to pretend that that's true. It's beyond me. The emperor has no clothes, folks. The emperor has no clothes. The emperor has no clothes. He's walking around naked. But no one is allowed. Look up everything I just said to you. Look up the post-World War II economic expansion. Right? Compare China before 1949 to China today. Compare Russia before 1917 to Russia in the 1930s or Russia in the 1960s. Compare Russia in the 1990s to Russia in our modern time. Look at the actual results of the economic policies in Chile. I'm not saying anything deeply profound, okay? This is not stuff that requires years of research. This is just basic data that shows socialism is very successful and free market neoliberal capitalism ain't. There's nothing remotely profound about what I'm saying here. I'm not telling you anything that isn't just common sense. However, there you go. This is our unnamed diet beverage. I don't drink alcohol. It's just unnamed diet beverage. It's diet blank. Can't say the thing because I don't want to give product placement. If the company that makes the unnamed diet beverage were actually to offer me some, product placement money, I might consider telling people and saying the name of what I'm drinking. But that is not the case, so I am being silent about it. But there you go. So, folks, I just thought I'd give you a piece of my mind. So, unnamed diet beverage it is. I'm finishing the first bottle. Got another bottle here if I want to continue it. I've also got some water. Yes, Lily, I've slipped and named it a few times. It's a mistake, but we're pretending we didn't see that. We're pretending we don't know what beverage it is. We're pretending I didn't just drip a little bit of it on my shirt, right? We don't acknowledge mistakes here. I'm just kidding. All right, folks. I guess, want to know what you're drinking and what you know about Scotland. Well, I've been to Scotland. I'm not going to say what I'm drinking. It's unnamed diet beverage. But what do I know about Scotland? What do I know about Scotland? All righty. That is on the list. And, folks, I think that I've ended my opening spiel. I don't know what, that was unplanned. Those were unplanned, off-the-cuff remarks. I talked about Shia Islam, and I talked about socialism and capitalism and libertarianism and economic data. And, so I think those are my opening remarks. So on that note, folks, I will call you out as I see you, names and locations. We'll do our roll call. And in that roll call, I will call you out as I see you. But if you haven't done so already, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. I know for a fact that 1 in 5 of you has not subscribed. If that is you, hit the subscribe button. Hit the notifications bell so that I make a point of calling you out. I see Jason Dunn in Edinburgh, Scotland, Sam Levin in Los Angeles, France, someone in France, Cleveland Pirate Alex, Croatia, Bendigo, Australia, David Fox, Little Falls, New Jersey, unnamed D from Scotland, Managua, right? Hello, Alex Giovanni in Salem, Oregon, Chicago. Lily from Atlanta, looking forward to October 17th. Albany, New York, Lawrence Chu, Yugoslavia, Nepal, Brazil, Riverside, California, Wokingham, UK, Sammy from the kitchen, Athens, Greece, Milwaukee, Amsterdam, Joanne, Scottish people, Charlie from Ottawa, Kendall in San Diego, Rocky from Reno, Nevada, Los Santos, Attica, New York, Patrick, Ligma, Will from Colorado, Key West, Florida, Antoine from France, Aaron Mixon in Edinburgh, Vallejo, California, Lyle from the People's Republic of China, Anton from Moscow, right? Lily behind the Iron Curtain, Ben in Denver, Espana, Elmau, Arizona, says Arthur Porter, Peter from Greece, Los Angeles, Paragus, Long Island, New York, Stanley Stan Lin, Somewhere, USA, Days from Denellen, Travis from West Palm Beach, Florida, Boris in the United States, Joe from Brussels, London, UK, Palo Round Mountain, California, Sam from Cleveland, Auckland, New Zealand. Where are you? I'm in Brooklyn, New York, Washington State, Derry, the Bronx, Mo in Pomona, California, Australia, Oz Whistles. Where are you? Liverpool, UK, a Brit in occupied Ireland. Heathrow, Dan from Pennsylvania, Sage in Utah. Free Belfast, Arizona. Bob is in Arizona. Julian from Southeast England, love to talk non-talk for religious people. Right? Harold in Naples, Florida. Welcome, Harold. Tijuana. Vancouver, Canada. Trevor in Ireland. Cascadia. Los Angeles, California, checking in, says Daniel A.G. Caleb, are you concerned about violent sentiment on the right wing? YouTube comments advocating killing communists. Okay. Alrighty. Cool. All right, folks. So now I think I will start going through these super chats one by one. We'll just start answering these super chats. Alrighty. So healthcare. Are conservatives going to finally see, now that Trump has got COVID, are they going to finally see that healthcare is the answer? National healthcare or single payer. Let's be clear about one thing, okay? That these terms get all jumbled around, right? Right-wingers think Obamacare is socialist communism or something, and I was actually late for this live. I was busy arguing with anti-China idiots. Well, welcome, Pony. Glad you're here. But healthcare, right? So we need to get some things clear. Something's very clear. There are many. These terms for healthcare get used interchangeably, and it annoys me. Okay. So Hillary Clinton, the Democrats for a long time have said that their position is for universal health care. What does that mean? Universal health care, all that means is that everyone has purchased health insurance. That's all that means. Everyone's insured. That's it. That's all that means, right? Doesn't say who they're insured by. They just want everyone to be insured. And in fact, George W. Bush proposed universal health care by making everyone pay a fine in their taxes if they don't get health care. And that's what Obama actually did. It was George W. Bush who came up with the idea of what they call a health care mandate, meaning that, that if you don't have health care, you get fined. And Barack Obama and Obamacare put that into law. Here in the United States, technically, if you don't have health care, you pay a $1,000 fine in your taxes. And that at the end of the day, that's technically universal health care, even though not most people, but a lot of people just take that fine. They just take the hit. So it doesn't really, whatever. So that's universal health care. It just means everyone's insured. And in the United States now, if you're not insured, you pay a penalty for not being insured. And that's supposed to motivate you to go and get health care. Universal health care is everyone's insured or supposed to be insured. So that's one. All right. Then there's what's called single payer, or let me back up. Then there's what's called a public option, right? And Obama originally proposed this to be part of Obamacare, and then he got rid of it. He changed his mind. And that would mean that there is private health insurance, but there is a government insurance plan that competes with it, right? So you can choose. Do you want to get the health insurance that's available from a private company, or do you want a public option? And the idea is the public option will be good, so the private companies will compete with it, and it'll set a standard, right? So Obamacare originally had that. Obama got rid of it. We don't have a public option. But the idea was there'd be a public option that would compete with the private insurance companies to make sure that they do a good job or something, right? That's what a public option is. Then there's what's called single payer. This is what they have in Canada. Single payer healthcare. Single payer healthcare means that there is one insurance plan from the government, that everyone, they pay their taxes and the government pays their medical bills. But all the hospitals are still private, all the drug companies are still private, whatever. But there's just single payer health insurance, meaning there's one insurance company. All public insurance. That's what they have in Canada. Then there's what's called national health care. And national health care is what they have in Britain, where the government runs the hospitals. The hospitals are run by the government. The hospitals are government institutions. The doctors get their paycheck from the government, just like firemen or police officers or whatever. Doctors are public employees. That is national health care, right? So Canada has single payer, where the hospitals are private, but the government pays is everyone's insurer. Britain has the national healthcare system, in which the government, hospitals are nationalized, right? That's what many European countries have. So there's a difference, right? And then socialist healthcare, let me add, is completely different as well. Socialist healthcare, right? In Britain, they have national healthcare. Britain's a capitalist country, but they have a national healthcare system, right? Well, socialist healthcare is healthcare that is done as part of a socialist, state centrally planned economy. Cuba has a socialist healthcare system, right? So that's the difference. That is the difference, right? And in the United States, many people have no clue about any of these things. They think Obamacare was socialist healthcare. No. Obamacare is way on the other end, right? There's universal healthcare, there's public option, there's single payer, there's national healthcare, and then there's socialist healthcare, right? There are many, these are different things, and people don't know what any of this means. And this was particularly annoying during the debate around the Affordable Health Care Act, the Affordable Care Act, when the right wing was going to meetings and waving guns around and screaming about how the government was going to pull the plug on grandma and, and death panels. And it was particularly annoying because what Obama implemented was Obamacare, which was basically a mandate, meaning that if you didn't buy health insurance, you would get a fine in your taxes, and it also meant that that in addition to that, that there was what you call originally there was supposed to be a public option, and then they got rid of it. So it was not single payer, definitely wasn't national health care, definitely was not socialist health care, right? And we need to differentiate between these different terms, because they all have different meanings, right? And what's wild is when people say things like, well, I've never seen, a national healthcare system actually work. It's like, well, most of the world either has national healthcare or single payer. Most of the world, has that, right? Almost every country in the world either has national health care or single payer. Every country in the world. So, just saying. If it's failing, then people should be miserable in like every country in the world. There should be French people like dying everywhere because they don't get the right health care. There should be British people dying. There should be Canadians like piling on the border. Please take us to America to get us out of this awful single payer system. I mean, this is a fantasy land. But if people want to live in that fantasy land where national health care or single payer health care doesn't work and results in everyone dying and starving because blah, 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 capitalism. If people want to maintain that fantasy, I mean, what can you do for? It's like, and people really want to believe that. They want to believe that. They really want to believe that if you provide people health care or you provide a state, single player plan, that everyone's going to just starve and die and be miserable. And it hasn't happened. Hasn't happened. Now, China's healthcare system is very complex, right? China's healthcare system is state-run, but there are many private corporations that are used as part of the state central plan, just like everything else. And in different areas, there are different amounts of it provided. We do know the New York Times got caught lying, just lying like a bearskin rug, to use, some, I don't know what that is, cowboy terminology. Nathan Rich just ripped them to shreds. The New York Times did this whole piece attacking China's healthcare system. They mistranslated people on purpose. They made it look like this line of people that was outside the hospital. They were in line to get health care. They were not. They were in line to see a specialist, not a regular doctor, but a specialist, and to see a specialist same day, right? If they had made an appointment to see a specialist, they wouldn't have had to wait in line. If they didn't want to see a specialist, they wouldn't have had to wait in line. But yes, to see a specialist on the same day, there's a group of people in line. And the New York Times made it look like they were all in line just to see a doctor when they're sick, mistranslated them, lied like a bearskin rug, they lied like a bearskin rug. I sound like, the sheriff. This town's only big enough for the both. This town ain't big enough for both of us. I'll meet you at high noon around there. Draw. I'm obviously, I'm sorry to say lying like a bearskin rug sounds like something stupid from a cowboy movie, but it's like when you're lying that blatantly about China's healthcare system, it's shocking to me. And watch Nathan Rich's video. I love Nathan Rich's stuff. He's retweeted me. He's retweeted some of my videos, and I appreciate that. China's healthcare system is pretty good. During the Mao era, they launched the Barefoot Doctors program, where the People's Liberation Army sent doctors all over the countryside. And a lot of these people, because of Mao, they had never seen a doctor in their entire lives. They did not know what a doctor was until somebody showed up and said, "Hi, I'm from the government, the new communist government, and I'm a barefoot doctor, and I'm here to give you health care." And people had never seen a doctor in their entire lives until the Mao launched the Barefoot Doctor program. They had the Barefoot Doctor program but yes, China's healthcare system, it's run by the state. The state controls it, but there are private healthcare companies that are like contracted. They bring in Western companies and they have joint ventures, so like Western medical technology can be used, and and that's good, right? I'm sorry, if China just if they weren't allowed to use any Western technology, they weren't allowed to partner with Western drug companies, they wouldn't be able to have the care that they have. China's healthcare is pretty decent. It could be better, right? And they need to improve it. But overall, China, in terms of average people's access to healthcare in the country, they've done pretty darn good. For raising 800 million people out of poverty, could it be better? Could it be cheaper and more affordable? Sure, but a lot of, the New York Times, the way they talked about it, and the fact they just lied. In China you have to pay when you go to the doctor. But at the end of the day, it's all directed by the state. Okay. Alrighty. Wow. Spent way too much time on that question. That's okay, right? What else are we going to do? I'm just sitting here drinking diet beverage. Hope you enjoyed your answer. Alrighty. Bezos, Soros, and Black Lives Matter. Okay. Well, that's an important point. All right. So Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, at least on paper, right? He's the Amazon guy. George Soros, who is the Hungarian billionaire who bankrolled the protests across the Eastern Bloc that toppled the Soviet Union and tends to donate to like Democratic Party linked causes and is like the boogeyman of the right wing, even though he's a vehement anti-communist. And Black Lives Matter, which is a hashtag, started out as a hashtag during the Trayvon Martin case, and then so there's something, it's important to differentiate here, all right? Now, again, this is where nuance is important, okay? So Black Lives Matter is a hashtag, and eventually it became a protest movement, right? And I mean, most recently after the George Floyd killing and Breonna Taylor, people march in the streets chanting Black Lives Matter, right? There is something called Black Lives Matter Incorporated, okay? So let's differentiate there. There's people in the streets chanting Black Lives Matter. There are people who tweet Black Lives Matter. There's an actual corporation, Black Lives Matter Incorporated. Black Lives Matter Incorporated is funded by George Soros. That's true. From what I understand, a lot of the staffers of Black Lives Matter Incorporated are actually former Teach for America teachers. And they are one wing of the, I mean, I'm sure they go to all the protests, and I'm sure, I mean, they are funded by George Soros, you betcha. Does that mean that every person who has ever protested for Black Lives Matter is a paid Soros employee? No, it means people who work for Black Lives Matter Incorporated, they get a paycheck from Soros and probably the Ford Foundation and probably some Rockefeller money, right? It's there is NGOs, they call them, non-governmental organizations. Yeah, sure. Did they play a role? Sure. As far as Bezos, again, Black Lives Matter is a hashtag. So, yeah, and why does George Soros support them? Well, George Soros is a liberal. And he probably believes that, liberals have often believed this, right? You go back to the civil rights, post-World War II, post-World War II, there was a huge explosion in the developing world, and African countries were joining up with the Soviet Union, and then, we still had lynchings in the United States. 1954, Emmett Till was lynched, right? Horrendous. He was accused of whistling at a white woman, a 14-year-old young man. And so he was just brutally, brutally killed, and then the murderers were acquitted. And there was a feeling, there's a very famous photo of his body. His mother allowed his dead body to be photographed, and the photo of this young man who's had his face just mutilated and was just brutally murdered by these racists. The Soviet Union took that picture and sent it all over the world, and they said, America says that they're a land of freedom and democracy. Well, look what they do to black people. And the Communist Party had the Civil Rights Congress, led by W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson and Henry Winston and William L. Patterson. And the Soviet Union arranged for William L. Patterson, a black civil rights leader and a Communist Party member, to give a speech at the UN condemning the United States for racism. So a lot of liberals felt like, okay, the communists have made the plight of black people in the United States one of their big causes that they're organizing around. And they're using it to humiliate us around the world. And, you want to get back to healthcare, right? Harry Truman tried to create national health care. And it was because of racism that it was defeated, because the government was not going to pay for a black hospital and a white hospital. It was not going to pay for a segregated healthcare system. So the northern wing of the Democratic Party, the Kennedy family in particular, but other folks in the northern wing of the Democratic Party, who were tired of getting kicked around by the Dixiecrats, right? Remember the Dixiecrats? The Democratic Party had the quote-unquote solid South, and they took action around it. They thought that it would stabilize the United States, right? Because they saw the black question as a ticking time bomb. They said so many black people are angry at the U.S. government. Malcolm X and black nationalism was rising. The Nation of Islam was growing. A lot of black people were sympathetic to the Communist Party. And because of that, they said the black question is a ticking time bomb. So why don't we diffuse it? And the Kennedy family, and they worked with the United Auto Workers, the UAW union, and they worked with some figures, Reverend Norman Thomas. They found Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who was the youngest minister in Alabama, right? Who would march for civil rights. All the older ministers in Montgomery, Alabama, in that particular town, Montgomery, Alabama. All the younger ministers had ties to all the older ministers, I should say, who were willing to march for civil rights, had ties to the Communist Party, so they wouldn't hire them. But Dr. Martin Luther King was a young man, and he was in Montgomery, Alabama. He was an effective orator, and he had no Communist Party ties, at least at that time. And so the civil rights movement was launched in the aftermath of the lynching of Emmett Till, in the aftermath of the Soviet Union, and doing a huge amount around that issue, and the Civil Rights Congress and all of that. There was a feeling, okay, we can't let the communists and the Soviet Union and the anti-imperialists and the Marxists, we can't let them. All right, Republicans lose Civil War. Spanish Civil War. We can't let them. We cannot let them. We cannot let them. The communists be the ones to utilize this issue, and so you had a civil rights movement, and the feeling among what was the center, for example, of the civil rights movement in New York City? Riverside Church. You ever been to Riverside Church? It's a beautiful, huge church in Harlem. Riverside Church. Well, folks, whose painting is on the walls of Riverside Church and who paid for Riverside Church? The Rockefellers. Everybody knows that. Riverside Church was a Rockefeller church. Everybody knows that. The Rockefeller, but Riverside Church, where Martin Luther King gave his famous Beyond Vietnam speech and all that, it was a Rockefeller church. And the Rockefellers felt like to stabilize the United States, we need to loosen up Jim Crow. We need to, that was a feeling. Now, it was because of all the great work that communists did that put pressure on the ruling class that they felt like they needed to create a safety valve. They felt like the black question in the United States was a ticking time bomb and it was going to explode, right? Now, you'll have to remember a lot of the military in the United States, a lot of the small business owners, a lot of the people, that were conservative, had the opposite view. They said if we create an opening, if we loosen up civil rights, that'll encourage communists, that'll encourage protests, and that was the debate throughout the whole Cold War. The Rockefellers said the way to defeat communism is we're going to loosen up the United States, we're going to loosen it up, and we're going to create chaos, and that chaos will spread into the socialist countries and create color revolutions. That was the Rockefeller position. And the position of the military-industrial complex and Nixon and the John Birch Society was we're going to militarize the United States, we're going to lock down, we're going to reinforce Christianity, and we're going to make the United States into a giant right-wing military dictatorship, and then we're going to march and have a big war and kill all the Reds. That was the debate. Do you defeat the communists with openness and fomenting chaos around the world? Or do you defeat the communists by locking down and becoming an authoritarian society? That was the debate. Nixon, the Republicans, the military-industrial complex wanted an authoritarian military approach to defeat the communists. Liberals, Rockefeller, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CIA, they wanted a chaotic, loose approach. That was the debate. And I would argue that the Rockefeller wing was more effective, right? That they were the more effective evil. Why? Because they went to Harvard and Yale and they studied this. How do you manipulate people? How do you control people, right? They conducted all kinds of crazy experiments to try and figure out how you control people. And they realized that military stuff, pointing a gun at somebody's head and ordering them to do something generally creates a lot of resentment. If someone points a gun at your head and tells you to do something, you might do it, but you're not going to like them, right? And that the more effective manipulation, is more covert, right? Get people addicted, right? Brainwash people. And the Rockefeller methods were very successful, and classic, right? Who bankrolled? For example, the father of behaviorism. Behaviorism, it's called. right? And what is behaviorism? How do you control people's behavior? B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner, right? Right, is the father of behavioral psychology. How do you control people's behavior? He discovered, and he's 100% right about this, that it is far more effective to manipulate people with rewards than it is with punishments. Right? Think about it. Think about it, right? I mean, okay, so if you do this, you will be punished. Right? No matter what, many people will say, you're being unfair to me, I'm being victimized, you're being cruel, you're imposing your will on me, and will resent the punisher and not change their behavior. It's common, right? When people are punished, people take it as a personal attack. It offends them. And they don't change their behavior. Prisons, look, I mean, they've talked about, like, the prisons. All these axe murderers and people who cut off people's heads, rapists, all kinds of people. A lot of them honestly believe they did nothing wrong. I'm dead serious. There are mass murderers in prison who sit there and go, nah, I didn't do anything wrong. Well, they had it coming. They deserved it. It's bizarre, right? People, when they get punished, they resent the punisher. But nobody resents getting a reward. If someone says, hey, John, I loved what you did the other day. Here is $100 just to show you how much I love what you did. Nobody is going to say, well, I don't think what I did was so good, so you can take your $100 and shove it up your... No one does that. They go, oh, well, I think it was pretty good myself. I'll take your $100, John. That's the way it works, right? So, at Harvard, at Yale, all these places, they're studying human behavior. Tavistock Institute, right? In the UK, Cambridge. They're studying how this stuff works. Oxford, right? And they're arguing that if we want to manipulate people around the world to get them to be anti-communist, we need to do it in a more subtle way. We can't just hold a gun to people's heads and tell them communism is satanic. If you read it, you're going against God's law and you will be shot. You can't. That's not going to work. It doesn't work. The Rockefeller approach is much more covert. It's much more... Anyway, I'm taking a long time to answer these questions, but there's always been a divide in the bourgeoisie. Bezos, Soros, they think that rather than, they think that there are a lot of, and they're right, that a lot of black people in the United States are very, very angry about the police state, and they're right. Bezos and Soros think it's best to create a safe outlet for that anger, to make the population feel like that need is being addressed. And that's why they're funding and making sure that no black nationalists like Minister Farrakhan, no communists are leading those protests. They're making sure that there are these carefully funded NGOs to lead and direct that struggle the way they want it. Meanwhile, the right wing says, well, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if black people have anger at the state. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter, right? These people of color, well, they need to respect the police. And so there's difference of approach, just like there was back in the 1960s, right? That there are different approaches to these questions, folks. There are different approaches to these questions. Okay. All right. Tips for debating anarchists. Tips for debating anarchists. I don't know, folks. I mean, I have never really found debates with anarchists to be very productive. I mean, when I was in high school, I was interested in anarchism, right? Because at the time, you'll remember that there was this whole, there was a lot of punk bands that were into anarchy and had the anarchy sign. And, there was a lot of that. And I remember I read so many anarchist FAQs, and I read Mikhail Bakunin, his book, God and the State, and I was, pumped up about it. But I could not get any text that would explain how anarchism would work. And that anarchism was it was more like a feeling. It was more like a vague understanding. I remember when I went to Occupy Wall Street, I met so many people who were like, I'm an anarchist. And I'd be like, oh, you like Proudhon? You like Bakunin? And they'd be like, no, man, I don't read books by other people. I have my own ideas. That's why I'm an anarchist. Nobody tells me what to think. Rah! And how did you want to become an anarchist? My favorite band. Duh. Yeah. I mean, it was just, there are some anarchists that I have been able to engage with and talk to and find out basically what they believe. What anarchists believe, for the most part, is that socialism needs to be created in a voluntary way. That you cannot, you cannot seize state power and use the state to create socialism. That people need to just kind of come together and build voluntary associations, communal gardens, collective, worker cooperative businesses and stuff, and that without state coercion, people need to build the new society on a voluntary and purely voluntary basis. That is anarchism. Right? And then there's anarcho-syndicalism that focuses on the workers occupying and seizing control of their workplaces, wants every business to be a cooperative, talks about the great general strike in the future. There's anarcho-communism, which is basically just it's almost like Marxism without Leninism. But at the end of the day, right, there's anarcho-communism, there's anarcho-syndicalism, there's just pure anarchism. At the end of the day, the differences between Marxism, between anarchism, between social democracy, you've all seen the broadcast I do with Brent. Brent and I don't agree about everything, but at the end of the day, his anarchism is very, very different from other anarchists. There are a lot of social democrats who sound almost like anarchists, and there are a lot of, these terms are just kind of words, right? What matters is the ideas. What matters at the end of the day is the ideas, at the end of the day, if I knew somebody who was an anarchist, I would try to talk to them and find common ground. I wouldn't even try to debate them. One thing that's very scary is there is a certain faction of anarchists who really do hate communists. Just hate communists. Think communists are the scum of the earth and want to engage in violence against communists. And that's really, really scary. And the other thing is that there's a lot of people who call themselves anarchists that are really social democrats. They just pretend, like Noam Chomsky says he's an anarchist. He's not an anarchist. He's a social democrat. He's a social democrat. That's all he is. Vote for the Democrats and enact social democratic policies. He's a social democrat, right? Anarchism is a belief we can get to a non-capitalist society without state coercion. Social democracy is the idea that capitalism just kind of naturally, one step at a time, turns into socialism. Marxism, Leninism, communism, revolutionary socialism is about seizing state power, seizing control of state power. That's the difference. Alrighty. And be clear about those differences, because I can guarantee you, the person who asked the question, I can guarantee you, most people that call themselves anarchists don't know of these differences and haven't even explored these questions. So if I were you, when I was debating or engaging with an anarchist, I would, actually press them to say what makes them not a social democrat, and force them to engage on these very questions and these very differences. Daniel DeLeon, Debs, and the IWW. Debs, DeLeon, IWW. All righty. Okay. All righty. What was the relationship between Baathists and communists? Well, the founder of Baathism was Michel Aflaq. Michel Aflaq was a Syrian from a Christian background. He joined the Syrian Communist Party, but he was very much an advocate of Syrian independence. He was a supporter of Arab nationalism. What's up with the incident where members of... I don't want to talk about that. Not a good idea to get into that. He was an Arab... a supporter of the Arab people in their fight for independence. Syria at that point was a French colony. So he was in the Communist Party, but the Communist Party was aligned with France. The Soviet Union was aligned with France against the Nazis during the Second World War, you'll recall. And there was a feeling in the Syrian Communist Party that since fascism was the main enemy, and since France was a what do you call it? Since France was a quote unquote democratic country against fascism, that the Syrian communists argued they shouldn't fight against France. They should focus on fighting Germany and Italy because the Soviet Union was under threat and fascism was the main danger. Michel Aflaq didn't agree with that. Michel Aflaq felt that because he was an Arab, he wanted to continue fighting for the independence of the Arab people. So he quit the Syrian Communist Party and he started the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party. So Baathism is a split from communism, right? It was a feeling that the Arab people needed to pursue their liberation, and because the Communist Party was focused on defeating the Nazis and defeating the Italian fascists, that there needed to be a new socialist, revolutionary, anti-imperialist movement for the Arab people. Now, Baathism strives for one united Arab republic, for all the Arab peoples to be united as one country, and it draws heavily from Marxism. They study Marxism extensively, but they also study the Quran and Islam. They also study the Arab tradition, and they seek to develop a socialism that is unique to the Arab people. It is a leftist philosophy. It's not fascism. Anyone who says it's fascism is an idiot. It's not fascism. It is it's socialism with Arab characteristics. And in some areas, it's a little more social democratic. In other areas, it's a little more hardline, ML, tanky kind of stuff. The Soviet Union understood that Syria and Iraq, which were both led by Ba'ath governments, were what they called socialist-oriented governments, SOGs, right? They realized the Communist Party was not in power, but that they were, they were socialist-oriented governments. Because in Syria and Iraq, the means of production were controlled by the state. The banks, factories, and industries were organized to serve the people. They had these revolutionary committees that they were called. And, it's a socialist country. It's not a Marxist-Leninist party that's come to power. It's a Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party that's come to power, right? Now, the difference between the Ba'ath Party and the Communist Party in Iraq and Syria is the Communist Party tended to align with the Soviet Union, whereas the Ba'ath Party, not so much. The Ba'ath Party sometimes would align with the Soviet Union, but not always. There were differences. You'll have to remember the Soviet Union and China didn't get along, right? There were times where the Soviet Union had détente with the United States. There were other times where the Soviet Union was, escalating with the United States. There were times when China was friendly to the United States. There were times when China was not as friendly. Well, the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party had an independent position, whereas the communist parties tended to align with the Soviet position, and the Maoist parties tended to align with the Chinese position, and then after the 80s, the Maoist parties just became ultra-leftists and irrelevant. That's the history there, okay? That's the history, and that's the difference, right? And in Iraq, many times Iraq and the Soviet Union didn't see eye to eye, and there were many times where there were leaders of the Communist Party that were arrested or put in prison sometimes. In Syria, there have been times where Communist Party leaders have been considered to be problematic and put in jail, but at this point, the Communist Party is very prominent in Syria, and they're in the government, they have seats, they're represented, and in Iraq and in Syria, the communist parties, it was a complex relationship because they didn't always get along. And the thing is, though, and I'll say this, if you were a serious Marxist in Syria or Iraq, and you were just a serious person, you wanted socialism, and there's this huge Ba'ath party that comes to power, and then there's this really tiny pro-Soviet Communist Party, which one are you going to join? Well, you're going to join the Ba'ath Party, right? And as a result of that, the communist parties in these countries often became a place for kind of naysayers. The same in Venezuela, right? Venezuela, Hugo Chavez formed the United Socialist Party. All kinds of, I don't even know what that is. I don't know what that is. What Burkean, I don't know what that is. The Communist Party of Venezuela, a lot of the members quit and joined the United Socialist Party. A lot of the Trotskyite groups merged into the United Socialist Party. But the Communist Party of Venezuela still exists, right? So there's the Communist Party, the official Communist Party of Venezuela, and then there's the United Socialist Party, which Chavez formed. Well, if you're a really serious revolutionary in Venezuela, you're going to join the United Socialist Party. But if you're kind of a naysayer, if you're kind of an ultra-left, you're going to stay in the Communist Party. So, and that's what happens. That's what happens. And that in countries where where it's not the official Communist Party that becomes the ruling party, when it's like a Ba'ath Party or a Bolivarian party, the Communist Party often becomes a place for people that are, I don't know what the right word, they don't want to go along with the crowd. They're kind of, people say naysayers, people that are just never satisfied, people that are kind of complaining and grumbling all the time, and they have their place. You need people that are going to be critical. You need people, right? I mean, Iraq needed the Communist Party to keep, the Ba'ath Party honest, right? If the Ba'ath Party started moving in a more, anti-communist direction, the Communist Party needed to be there to say, whoa, stop it. In Venezuela, they need the Communist Party. The Communist Party can be there to, hold Bolivarianism accountable. But, that's how, that's the thing. And it kind of, in the United States, for example, right, in the Black Liberation Movement in the 1970s, if you were just a serious Black liberation fighter, you believed in Marxism, you joined the Black Panthers, right? Black Panthers were huge. They made history. But, there were some people of color who joined like a Trotskyite group or joined a small Maoist group or something, right? Well, there's a reason they did that. There's a reason they didn't join the huge Black Panther Party. There's a reason they joined, a small Maoist group or a small Trotskyite group. And that these kind of things become very important. People think this is all irrelevant. It's not irrelevant, right? This kind of thing is very, very important. After the Russian Revolution, they had 3 political parties in Russia. That you didn't know that. But after the Russian Revolution, there was the Bolshevik Party, was the ruling party. Was the main party. But there was also the Revolutionary Socialist Party, the Anarchist Party, the party of Peter Kropotkin, the Social Revolutionary Party. And there was the Left Menshevik Party, right? Which was, they didn't join the Bolsheviks. They were Mensheviks who supported the Russian Revolution. And originally, all 3 of those parties had seats in the government. All 3 of them. But both of them became a place for destabilization, and both of them started getting supported by Western intelligence to work against the Bolsheviks. And you'll remember that a member of the Left Socialist Revolutionary Party shot Lenin, shot him, almost killed him, right? And eventually, the Bolsheviks outlawed those 2 other parties because they became bases for counter-revolution within the country. Now, again, there's a reason, right? Because, again, everyone who was serious about Bolshevism ended up joining the Bolsheviks. Now, it would have been better if the Soviet Union had been in a position where they could have kept those 2 parties legal. But, when you're fighting for your life and people are starving and there are civil wars going on, obviously that's not the same thing. So you have to remember how these things work. That when revolutions happen, they often, it's not like you just sit there and go, this is how I want it to be. Material conditions define how things are going to be, right? And that it's like, oh, do I agree with Baathism or do I agree with communism? Well, I'm going to study both of them, and based on that, it's not how these things work, And countries that have civil wars, for example, right? Often people end up on the side that their neighborhood is on. Their neighborhood, their family, right? I hate to put it this way, but, and this sounds really awful, but in the United States, right, the U.S. Civil War happens. White Americans, right, you were in the South, the chances are you were on the southern side of that war. If you were in the North, the chances were you were on the northern side of the war. Now, there were exceptions, heroic exceptions, like the Jones County, right, Free State of Jones, great movie, go see it, right, and there were exceptions. Throughout the South, there were anti-slavery uprisings where whites and blacks joined arm in arm to fight against slavery. But for the most part, you were a white person, you're in the South, you took the southern side. Why wouldn't you? Everyone you know is pro-slavery, the government's pro-slavery, and even though slavery's bad for you economically as a low-income white person, even though you can see with your own eyes how horrendous it is for black people, well, everyone here is for it. The newspapers I read are for it. My church is for it. Oh, okay, I'm for it. People in the North, though, right? The North was against slavery. So people in the North, right? Everyone they knew was against slavery. Their churches were against slavery. The newspapers were against slavery. Everyone in their town was against slavery, so they were against slavery. Most people don't think about politics the way you and I do. You and I, we're on here, we're engaging about politics with a high level of depth on YouTube. You and I, you could be bowling right now. You could be doing drugs right now. You could be watching Netflix right now. Instead, you're talking to me about politics. Okay? And that means you're somebody who thinks about these things with a lot of depth. Most people in the world do not do that. I'm just telling you, right? Most people in the world, I mean, even now, right? We're not having a war, okay? But, in the United States, think about it, right? Here in the United States, right now, if you're in a red state and everyone you work with at your job is a Trump supporter or Republican, and everyone at your church is a Republican, and, people read Republican newspapers, the chances are you're going to be a Republican. You're going to vote for Trump. But if you're in a blue state and your family are all Democrats, and, people at your job that you work with are Democrats, the people in your religious community or whatever your social network is are Democrats, you're going to be a Democrat. Most people don't think about this stuff with very much depth. Okay? That's just the reality of this. So in a lot of these countries, right, it's like, well, why is this person a Ba'athist and not a communist? In a lot of cases, it has to do with what town they're from and who they're friends with and who, for example, right, in Syria, right, there's the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party. There is the Communist Party of Syria. There is the Communist Party of Syria, Bakdash, which is like an anti-revisionist, like more hardline, tanky communist party. And then there's also the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. Well, what is the difference between the Syrian Social Nationalist Party and the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party? What's the difference? Well, here's the difference. Okay? Officially, the difference is that Ba'athists are for one united Arab nation. They say all Arabs are the same nation. They should all have one country. Social nationalists, Syrian social nationalists, say that the Syrian people are a separate nation. Right? They say, well, no, we're not Arabs, we're Syrians, and that Syrians are a separate nation. That's the difference on paper. Do you know what the real difference is? What the real actual difference between those two parties is? The Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party are Sunni Muslims and Alawites, and the Syrian Social Nationalist Party are Christians. That's the difference. That's really what the difference is. The Syrian Social Nationalists are Christians, and the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party are Muslims. That's really the difference, right? And that if you're a Christian in Syria, right, you're not going to want Syria to merge in with all the other Arab countries because Christians are going to be a tiny minority. Think about it. But if you're a Muslim, of course you're going to want all the Arab people to merge into one because you're part of that majority. So that's the difference, folks. That often people's political affiliation is based on what town they're from, who they're related to. I mean, it's not that simple, right? And people want to blow these things up, and it's not that simple. Okay. Peaceful revolutions. What, someone asked, has there ever been a peaceful revolution? Well, that's a hard, what is peaceful? Venezuela, was that a peaceful revolution? They got elected, they took power, they wrote a new constitution, but there was an attempted coup. That was pretty violent. A lot of people died in the attempted coup, but they defeated the attempted coup. They came back, but they've had to use violence to defend their revolution, but they took power peacefully, right? So, it was a peaceful transition to socialism that then they had to use violence to defend. So, was that a peace? I would say Venezuela is fully socialist. But, did they end up having to use violence to defend it? Yes. But did they take power through, storming the barricades or something? No. All state power is violent. What is state power, right? The state itself is defined by violence. The government has the right to use violence. You don't, right? The cops can use violence on you. You can't use violence on them. That's state power. State power is the state uses violence. So if at any point you are going to take state power, that's violent to some degree or other. I mean, even if you get peacefully elected, right, you are going to then have to, at some point, use violence. If I got elected president of the United States, I would be surrounded by Secret Service guys. And if someone tried to then kill me and remove me the presidency, those Secret Service guys would use violence against them. So would that be violent? I mean, anything involving government and state power involves violence to some degree or other. So it's a question of how, right? Now, Venezuela, Nicaragua had a violent revolution. They were voted out of power. They got voted back in. The Russian Revolution, the actual events of 1917 were pretty bloodless. I mean, there was some killing, but it was pretty, the storming of the Winter Palace and all that was pretty, it was pretty tame. It was after the Russian Revolution. It was the Russian Civil War that was extremely violent and millions of people died. But the actual Bolshevik seizure of power, the 10 days that shook the world that John Reed wrote about, I mean, there was some killing, but it wasn't, compared to what happened afterwards, the Russian Civil War, it was pretty tame. But I guess, peaceful revolution. I mean, I think that all socialists, and I've said this many times, should be very clear that they want and advocate a peaceful democratic transition to socialism, that they don't advocate killing, they don't advocate violence. However, the ruling class will be very violent and very anti-democratic in an effort to beat back the people's movement, and that people in such circumstances have the right to defend themselves. I've always made that very, very clear. I hope that answers your question. It's kind of a strange thing. Have you ever seen a peaceful revolution? Was Venezuela's revolution peaceful? I mean, no. I mean, right? But, say Salvador Allende, right? Salvador Allende got elected, right? He ended up being removed by the military. But say he hadn't. Would that have been peaceful? Well, I'm sure Salvador Allende had Secret Service guys. I'm sure Salvador Allende had police. And imagine if Salvador Allende had been able to stop the Pinochet coup. Imagine he'd had the support in the military necessary to stop it. Would those people have been violent? Would it have required violence on Salvador Allende's part to defeat Pinochet? Yes. So, it's like all situations in which you have a government, all situations in which you have state power, there is some level of violence or threat of violence. There's some level of coercion involved. So it's a matter of how violent is it. But as long as there is some state involved, there's violence, right? That's what the state is. The state is a threat of violence. So it's a bit of a confusing question. I hope I answered it correctly. How do I know my employer is mistreating me? Well, what you have to remember is with your employer, with any employer, it's always a negotiation. Your employer, it's, how much work will you do? Your question is, what will I get out of it, right? And that, it's a negotiation. Now, obviously, if your employer is violating labor laws, I think that's mistreatment. If you feel like you're mistreated and you argue about it, and that's something that's specific to every situation. No, someone wants me to live in the UK. Well, that's sweet. I'd love to come to the UK. UK is beautiful. I haven't been there since I was a kid. But yeah, I think that every employer-employee relationship has unique circumstances to it. Obviously, there are labor laws in the United States. Obviously, there are things like contracts. So it's hard to say. But in your situation, if you are unhappy with your situation, look into the details and see if you feel like it's a violation, and see if you want to, push back, right? That's how these things work, and it depends on your situation. All righty. All right. Now, David Fox, he asked, is the disaster of U.S. politics a disaster of capitalism? Absolutely it is, right? The society we are living in is highly unstable. Living standards are dropping. There are divisions in the ruling class. The rate of profit is declining, and the capitalists are fighting amongst each other. The working class of all stratas is angry, and the ruling class is panicking. And yes, I would say more than ever right now, the crisis in the United States is a crisis of capitalism. Capitalism couldn't handle this pandemic. Capitalism can't deal with the fact it doesn't have a place for millions of us at the assembly line. It's got a whole generation of people that are never going to have really stable jobs. You know what I mean? We're creating a generation of people that are stuck in low-wage, short-term service sector jobs. Yeah, I mean, I would say this is a crisis of capitalism. This is definitely a crisis of capitalism, and it's reflecting itself in politics. Alrighty. What do I know about Scotland? Well, Scotland's a country. I'm just kidding. But no, I've been to Scotland when I was a kid. I went to Scotland. I went to Stirlingshire. I got to see Stirling Castle. That was pretty neat. I went to Edinburgh. Got to see Edinburgh. That was pretty neat. Um, you know, yeah, Scotland's beautiful. You have the Highlands, you have the Lowlands. Scotland's got a lot of natural gas, lots of natural gas. And I think the debate around Scottish independence, underlying it, is the question of who will control that natural gas, right? And that if Scotland were to become independent, that would lead to renegotiating, who got control of that oil and natural gas. The SNP has framed itself as the party that very much wants to, be the party that keeps the welfare state intact. And Scotland is more left-wing politically than the rest of the UK. There's a whole tradition there of the miners, and labor unions have more influence. It's interesting. Scotland's more socially conservative, right? It's very complicated. I've actually told people what's particularly fascinating to me is that Adam Smith, kind of the first guy to kind of lay out the British Empire free trade view of economics, was Scottish. He was a Scottish Presbyterian, and he was alive at a time there was a genocide in the Scottish Highlands against the Highlanders of Scotland, who were Roman Catholic, and there was the Jacobite uprising, and that was an attempt. The Scottish Highlanders, aligned with France, tried to put a Roman Catholic king on the throne. It was a mass uprising. They weren't fighting for Scottish independence. They wanted to have a Catholic king of all of Britain, and it was defeated. And after the Jacobite uprising was defeated, there was then a genocide of the Scottish Highlanders, who were Roman Catholic, and they cleared the land, the Highland clearances, where they just forced all these people off the land, killed them. A lot of people came to the United States during that time due to the Highland clearances. And actually, it's kind of interesting. When I was a kid, I used to go to bluegrass concerts with my parents, right? My parents were really into folk music, bluegrass music. And I used to hear bluegrass music. Over the river to feed my sheep, over the river, Charlie, over the river to feed my sheep, take cake for Charlie. Charlie, he's a fine young man. Charlie, he's quite dandy. Charlie likes to go to town and give the ladies candy. Right? What? That's a hillbilly redneck song, right? What's it actually about? Well, Charlie in the song is Bonnie Prince Charlie, and that's the leader of the Jacobite uprising, the great pretender or whatever that they wanted to put on the throne. And there's a couple of them. There's a couple of those old kind of hillbilly Appalachian songs that are about this Charlie figure who's romantic and heroic. It's probably generations. It just got passed on by generations. But originally, those songs were about Bonnie Prince Charlie. And a lot of the Scottish Highlanders were, because they were Catholic, were forced at the barrel of a gun to leave their homes in the Highlands clearances. It's kind of fascinating. And Adam Smith was a Scottish Presbyterian who opposed the Jacobites. And in his writing, he speaks with utter contempt for his own people. He's a self-hating Scotsman. Throughout his writings, he uses the phrase, the civilizing influence of commerce. And what Adam Smith went to Oxford, right? He studied among the English. And while this Jacobite uprising is going on, he's a Scotsman who studies among the English. And there is still to this day a lot of bigotry against Scotsmen among English people. They think Scotsmen are stingy. That's a stereotype. They're all cheap, stingy people, greedy. They think Scotsmen are stupid, working class people. They think they're violent. There's all kinds of English stereotypes about Scots, right? And when I went to Scotland when I was a kid, I remember talking about this. Like, I mean, it was like, the Scots telling us how much they hated the English. And, we're just tourists from the United States. And they're like, we hate the English. We hate the English. And you go to the English and they're like, oh, those Scotsmen, they're a bunch of, I mean, there's a lot of, these people have been living next to each other for thousands of years. There's built-in tension. Well, Adam Smith, he studied at Oxford, right? And he studies at Oxford, and he's at Oxford, and in Oxford, right, he's a Scotsman at Oxford. Well, there's an uprising going on, and all these British people are going and dying to fight against the Jacobites. So he was very much probably, mistreated as a Scotsman, right? And so he went back to Glasgow, and he presided over genocide against his own people. And he's writing that, gosh, we Scots, we're such barbarians. We're primitive barbarians. But thank God, capitalism, the civilizing influence of commerce, maybe it'll make us stop being savages. I mean, it's self-hatred. I mean, it is self-hatred if you've ever seen it. I mean, that's what pours out of Adam Smith's writings, right? Is that he was ashamed to be a Scotsman. He believed his people were barbarians and were primitive, and that hoped that maybe the free market and capitalism would free them. And he hoped that Glasgow could become just as big as London, right? London was the center of global free trade capitalism. He was hoping that Glasgow could become, a free trade capitalist center. That's who Adam Smith was. Somebody in the chat, they said William Wallace was nothing like the Braveheart movie. Well, they're absolutely right about that. They're absolutely right. I remember when I was in Scotland when I was a kid, out in front of, there's a building called the Wallace Tower, which is like a museum honoring William Wallace. And they have all kinds of paintings of William Wallace, throughout the years. And the paintings, he all has a big beard. He's like 6 feet tall. But I remember, someone pointing out that after the Braveheart movie came out, they put a statue of William Wallace out in front of the Wallace Tower. And that statue of William Wallace, was not really a statue of William Wallace. It's a statue of Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson made Braveheart. And, it's a movie that, it has very little to do with actual history. It's a romanticization of William Wallace's uprising. William Wallace, William Wallace was a noble, first of all. He was, of noble birth. William Wallace, his wife was killed by the English, but he had already been a leader of the uprisings before that. He didn't join the uprisings because she was killed. The idea, in the movie, they have William Wallace having an affair with the princess, and becoming like the father of Edward III or something. That's ridiculous. That didn't happen. Edward II of England was gay. That's true. Edward II was gay, and that's true. But the idea that William Wallace fathered a future king of England because Edward II was gay, and they sent the princess to go negotiate with him. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. And actually, that princess was like 8 years old at the time William Wallace was doing his thing. So that's particularly ridiculous. Edward I, King Edward I, they called him Longshanks. That was his nickname. He was a tall guy. He had long legs. He was Longshanks. And I guess, though, supposedly Edward I, right, apparently, like, going and fighting William Wallace, like, really energized him, right? That he was this old man, but going out and fighting William Wallace made him feel like a young man again or something. I don't know. That's what they write about. William Wallace was killed in some particularly ugly ways. And this is one thing. People talk about Mel Gibson, right? Mel Gibson, he made Passion of the Christ. He made Mad Max. He made, at the end of the movie Braveheart, they have William Wallace being executed and being, it was pretty brutal the way they killed him. He was tortured to death. But in the movie, they have it so, like, if he will just, surrender, they'll stop torturing him and just kill him. They didn't do that. That was not how it worked. They did execute William Wallace horrendously. Horrendous, hung, drawn, and quartered. Not a good way to die, if ever. Yuck, But at no point did they stop and say, we can stop doing this if you'll just swear allegiance. They did not do that. That's not, there was no opt-out button, okay? They tortured him to death. They sentenced him to death. They tortured him to death. That's it. There was no opt-out button, right? But in the movie, they want to make him look like a heroic martyr. So it's like he's like, freedom. It's Hollywood, and it's a little weird. But yeah, there was no opt-out of the execution. They didn't give him the chance to opt out of it. They just, that's it. I mean, they just executed him and tortured him to death. And they cut his body into 4 pieces, I believe, and put the 4 pieces of his body on display. It was pretty awful. The way that they killed William Wallace was pretty horrendous. Yeah, I mean, yeah, the Braveheart movie, it's a fun movie. It's a great movie. I mean, it was one of my favorite movies when I was a kid, when I was like a teenager. It was a great movie. I loved that movie when I was a kid. And I found out that in Iran, they love that movie as well. The Iranians, there was an Iranian movie director who told me that's the most Shia movie that he has ever seen, is Braveheart. Well, there you go. I mean, it's about martyrdom and sacrifice and fighting for your community. And, so, I mean, a lot of people all over the world really like the movie Braveheart. So there you go. But it has nothing to do with, I mean, it's completely, it's completely divorced from the actual history. William Wallace had a big, huge beard. He was actually like 6 feet tall, almost 7 feet tall. He was a really tall guy. And, he was from the noble class. He was from nobility, and he led this uprising, and he was executed. That's about it. David Fox says he loves the Mad Max movies. Well, I feel like we're living in one. Jesus. I mean, I hope it doesn't get that bad, but, Mad Max, it's Mel Gibson's movies about like a post-nuclear war world. It's this like apocalyptic kind of series that Mel Gibson made. I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm living in one. Christ, what are we talking about here? What are we talking about? All right, I'm sorry. I'll get back to what we were... All right. Right-wingers advocating killing communists on the internet, on YouTube comments and stuff. Yeah, it's disturbing, but I mean, whatever. I mean, they're going to do that. You have to remember that you can't take people on the internet too seriously. You can't, because they're trying to get a rise out of you, right? It's edgelording, it's trolling. So you have to remember that people on the internet can be childish. They can be childish. So, but is it concerning? Yes. And the fact that Donald Trump is in his, everyone's a communist. I mean, I said the other day, socialism in American politics right now is got to be the darndest thing. So in socialism right now, you've got a whole generation of young people that are like, I love socialism. And then you got the whole Trump movement. We hate socialism. Go to one of those Trump people, or go to one of those Bernie young people. Ask them what socialism is. None of them can tell you. None of them can tell you. I mean, the debate in American politics, ever since like the 2008 financial crisis in particular, has been a debate about socialism. The right wing is like, oh my God, we got to stop socialism. And a couple years later, rise of Bernie Sanders. Now the left, there's a lot of people on the left, not the mainstream of the Democratic Party, but a lot of the Democratic base is like, I love socialism. Ask any of them what socialism is. You're going to get crickets. You'll get answers, but they don't make any sense. Ask the right-wingers, what's socialism? It's the government running everything. Well, okay, everything? Don't people have private property in China? Can you name a socialist country? Young people, ask them, what's socialism? It's the government giving people free healthcare, free education. Well, don't they do that in Britain? Don't they do that in, socialism is worker cooperatives. Socialism is, I don't know. It's a mess. Nobody knows what socialism is, but everyone's mad about socialism. Socialism is a vague concept. It's like we're almost arguing. We're having an argument now in the United States. I swear, we're having an argument. It's not about socialism. It's about how mean we should be. How mean we should be and how much we should love hard work, right? And the right-wingers are going around, I hate socialism. Why? Because I'm mean to people. I don't have compassion for people. People need to get a job. They're lazy. And I love working hard. I worked hard. They hate socialism because they love working hard and they love being mean to people. Young people, they're like, I love socialism. Why? Because I don't want to work hard and because I want to be nice to people. Well, I'm with the young people on the being nice to people. 100%. Yeah, the heartless libertarian edgelord. Oh, don't give anyone anything for free. I hate that. So I'm with the young people on the be nice to people. But I'll be honest, I'm with the old people on the working hard part. We do need, I mean, a lot of millennials, there's just this lack of drive, right? There's just this pessimism, this hopelessness, this lack of energy. So it's like, I guess I'm half right wing and half left wing. I believe in hard work, and I also don't believe in being an asshole and being mean to people, right? I have compassion. I believe in human brotherhood, and I don't want anyone to be hungry, and I want people to be taken care of. So, um, you know, I don't think socialism should be fuck this, give me free stuff. I mean, it's better that people get free stuff than don't, right? I'm for people getting healthcare, getting education. But I think that socialism, if it's ever going to catch on in the United States, sorry, I got to readjust the pillows I'm sitting on. If socialism is ever going to catch on in the United States, it's got to somehow be combined with the American hard work ethic. It's got to be combined with optimism. It's got to be combined with the American dream. You have to somehow, you can't have socialism just be fuck this, give me free stuff. Because at the end of the day, the American people are never really going to go for that. The whole history of the country, is people working hard, trying to accomplish things, sometimes being successful, sometimes not. So, we need a socialism that embraces the go out, work hard, achieve your dreams, American ethic, but at the same time doesn't have the cruelty, the rugged individualism that goes with it. We need a socialism that combines the American optimism, the American motor-mindedness, the American drive, but doesn't have the settler racism, the pioneer individualism, the indifference. We need a collectivist optimism. We need a collectivist optimism. We need a collectivist hard work. We need oneness. We need a community of mankind. We need a brotherhood and sisterhood of man. That's my position on all of that. So I hope that answers your question. Why did the Republicans lose the Spanish Civil War? Well, I think one of the main reasons they lost the Spanish Civil War is because there was only two countries in the world that supported the Spanish Republic, Mexico and the Soviet Union. And the rest of the world was either against them publicly or just kind of against them, right? I mean, the United States officially, the United States was neutral in the Spanish Civil War, but we all know that Henry Ford and J.P. Morgan and all kinds of wealthy people in the United States were supporting Franco, right? Or indirectly, they would give the support to Hitler, and Hitler would give the money to Franco, right? Britain was officially neutral in the Spanish Civil War, but there was a lot of British support going to Franco. Meanwhile, only Mexico and the Soviet Union helped the Spanish Republic. I think one of the key factors was that Catholics around the world were fed a lot of propaganda. They were propagandized to believe that the Spanish Republic was killing priests and nuns. The Catholic Church was key in the Spanish Republic being defeated. In Spain, though, there were many priests and there were many nuns who supported the Spanish Republic. But globally, the propaganda that went out to Catholics turned Catholics against the Spanish Republic. I think that had a factor as well. Alrighty. What do I think of Debs, DeLeon, and the IWW? Well, those are three separate questions, so let's get them one by one. Eugene Debs was one of the most important figures in American history. Eugene Debs was an amazing person. Eugene Debs was the traveling preacher of socialism. He was a man. He had been a leader of the Railroad Workers Union. He'd gone to prison for leading a railroad workers strike. And in prison, he had discovered Marxism and socialism, and he came out of prison determined to be a socialist, to preach socialism. And he went around the United States stirring up people with speeches about socialism. And he was a very effective speaker and orator, and he was very simple, and he would explain socialism in very, very clear language. And he was an amazing, dynamic individual. He was a preacher for socialism. He was the socialist evangelist who went from town to town all across America urging people to be socialists. He ran for president a bunch of times. He believed in socialism, and he spread socialism across America. Millions of people would go to his speeches. He was a saint, and he was put in prison for daring to speak up against the First World War, for using his freedom of speech. and he, in prison, he suffered horrendously, and he eventually got out of prison and died shortly afterwards. Eugene Debs is an iconic American hero, if there ever was one. He could have been better. I mean, he was opposed to racism, but he was kind of an advocate of what you might call a colorblind socialism, and he could have been better on the race question. But I mean, Eugene Debs was amazing in many, many ways. Me like Debs. All right, DeLeon, Daniel DeLeon. Well, Daniel DeLeon came before Eugene Debs. Daniel DeLeon, he was a professor at Columbia University, and he became a Marxist, and he supported the economist Henry George when he ran for mayor of New York City, and he was fired from his job at Columbia University because he supported that campaign. And so he launched the Socialist Labor Party, the SLP. The SLP. And this was long before Eugene Debs. The SLP was the first major Marxist party in the United States. And their symbol was an arm holding a hammer. They had the weekly people. And Eugene Debs, Daniel DeLeon, he was before Debs. He was popularizing Marxism. He was never anywhere as near as popular as Debs because he was a little bit of an ultra-left. He took some pretty ultra-left positions that kind of made him a little bit inaccessible. I mean, I think Debs was a mass organizer. He brought socialism to as broad an audience as possible. DeLeon was a little bit more. He built kind of a cult, right? He built kind of a cult around himself. Eugene Debs, all kinds of people, atheists, Christians, Republicans, Democrats, all kinds of people loved Debs. Everybody could love Debs. He could carry any audience. He could talk to anybody. DeLeon, you were with him or against him. You were with DeLeon or you were against DeLeon. DeLeon was an ideologue, right? Daniel DeLeon, he formed the SLP. Like Daniel DeLeon, he took some positions like, for example, at the time, all across the United States, there was a big movement against what they called the trusts, right? Which were these big, corporate conglomerates, cartels. There was a movement demanding the trusts be busted, right? And there was a mass movement, labor unions, small farmers against the trusts. Well, Daniel DeLeon went around saying, no, we shouldn't oppose the trusts. They're good because after the revolution, when we nationalize them, that'll be easier. So he said, he wrote pamphlets, the working class loves the trusts, socialists support the trusts. Well, what did that do? If you were in this mass movement against big business, against the trusts, Marxists couldn't relate to you. Right? But that's an ultra-leftist position. If there's a mass mobilization against the trusts, which are a big capital, Marxists should go to it and find common ground and win those people to be socialists. Well, Daniel DeLeon's position was, no, we like trusts because you shouldn't join the anti-trust movement, you should join the socialist movement. He took a lot of positions like that. He was a founder of the IWW, but they kicked him out pretty quick, and he opposed the labor movement. Right? He argued that having a labor movement, was bad because it just made capitalism work better, and that instead of trade unions, he was for socialism. There's actually a pamphlet he wrote called "Trade Unions or Socialism." Well, I'm for both. I think people should have the right to join a union, and I'm for socialism. Daniel DeLeon said, I'm not for trade unions, I'm for socialism. He was a bit of an ultra-left, but he still made a dynamic contribution. And there would be no Debs without DeLeon, right? Eugene Debs learned about Marxism from followers of Daniel DeLeon. And I think briefly Debs was in Daniel DeLeon's organization. So, you couldn't have had Debs without DeLeon. Daniel DeLeon, nobody had heard of Marxism in the United States. No one had ever heard of Marxism in the United States. So Daniel DeLeon, he went around promoting it. His ideology, JT24 points out, was called impossibilism, which is an ultra-left deviation, right? It's an ultra-left deviation. I mean, but at the end of the day, Daniel DeLeon, he played a very good progressive role, even though he had his shortcomings. He was different than Debs. So, and then the IWW. Well, the IWW was the Industrial Workers of the World. Now, their nickname was the Wobblies. The Wobblies. And the IWW, so you have to remember, at the time in the United States, the main labor federation was called the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. The AFL was racist. It was whites only. And the AFL also, you had to be a, quote, skilled worker to be a member of it. They didn't allow factory workers. Steel workers couldn't be in it. Coal miners couldn't be in it. It was only for skilled workers, and you had to be white. So the AFL didn't want to organize what they called industrial workers. They called them unskilled. So the IWW was founded by Marxists and revolutionaries, and it was a union for all workers. It was called One Big Union. And the idea was the pipe fitters and the construction workers, but also the steel workers and also the coal miners. Someone would like to know what I think of the European Union. Okay, I don't know who that name is, but all right, that's next on the list. EU. The pipe fitters and all of them would be in one big union. That was the IWW. And they were more syndicalist, meaning they were not focused on, they didn't believe in running in elections and running candidates. They didn't believe in state power. They believed in only direct action on the job. It's anarcho-syndicalism. They wanted the workers to seize their factories. One big union. And the IWW, they didn't sign contracts with the bosses because they said if you sign a contract with a boss, if you do that, then at that point you are recognizing that the employer has the right to exploit your labor. They didn't sign contracts. In the IWW, they led strikes. In Passaic, New Jersey, they led a very long strike among the textile workers. In Colorado, among coal miners, Big Bill Haywood. They did a lot of very, how does one relate to the various definitions of socialism? Okay. Definitions of socialism. All right. They didn't. I mean, they were a very important group, and they opposed World War I, and they were smashed when World War I broke out. All righty. How do I feel about the European Union? I'm against it. Right. The European Union has always been a vehicle for exploiting workers, for making, grinding workers across Europe into greater poverty, for driving wages down. The European Union has always been bad for working class people. And legitimate Marxists and leftists have always opposed the European Union. And that's just common sense. The European Union, Marxists and leftists always opposed the European Union. Always, 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 right? And so the fact that now there's this atmosphere created where if you oppose the European Union, oh, you're on the right. Well, no, the left opposed the European Union long before the right. And in fact, who kind of invented the European Union? Who was the father of the European Union? Oswald Mosley, the father of British fascism, right? In the final years of his life, he went around advocating a European Union. Right? Oswald Mosley, the fascist, was an advocate of a European Union. Listen to him. In the final years of his life, he was going around and he was saying, all the white masses of Europe need to join one European Union. So the pro-Hitler guy in Britain, long before there was a European Union, after World War II, he went around talking about the need to form a European Union, right? That would be anti-U.S. and anti-Soviet, right? Oswald Mosley, look on the internet. The final years of his life, what did he do? He went around advocating that all the European nations join into being one country, a European Union. That's what he advocated. Now, Trotsky was also an advocate of a European Union. He advocated the United States of Europe. And Lenin ripped Trotsky to shreds for that and said, no, if the European imperialist powers were combined into one, the result would be bad for the people of the world. It would be bad for the workers of those countries. We do not advocate the United States of Europe. That's one of Trotsky and Lenin's big disagreements. Lenin was against Trotsky's vision of a USSE, whereas Trotsky was for it. So Trotsky, Oswald Mosley, they advocated a European Union because they thought it would be good for imperialism. Marxists have always opposed it. Okay, all right, definitions of socialism. Well, the first person to ever use the word socialism, it was in French. It was Henry Saint-Simon. And his definition of it was at the time the French Revolution had just come about, and the slogan of the French Revolution, they identified their ideology as liberalism, which was the celebration of the individual. And so a lot of people were starving, there was poverty and stuff. So Henry Saint-Simon came up with the idea that he opposed liberalism, and he said, we got too much liberalism after the French Revolution. Instead of liberalism, which is about individuals, we'll have socialism, which will be the opposite of liberalism. And he never really explained what it was. It was just, he had some worker cooperatives, he fed hungry children and had to do a lot of charity work. And he said, I believe in socialism, which is the opposite of what the French Revolution believes in, because they believe in liberalism. That's Henry Saint-Simon. Robert Owen was the first person to use the word socialism in the English language. Now, Robert Owen, he was from Wales, and he was a wealthy factory owner, but he did not like the way factory workers were treated, so he started, he built like in a place, I believe it was in Scotland, a place called New Lanark. He built like a modern commune city. He eventually moved to Indiana in the United States, and he set up a commune there in a place called New Harmony. And he believed that you needed to have these little egalitarian communes where everyone shared everything, and it was kind of cooperative model cities. That's what he believed in. And there's a very important pamphlet, which I will soon be publishing my own edition of, called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, where Friedrich Engels differentiates Karl Marx's teachings and scientific socialism from these previous forms of socialism, right? And he says that socialism comes about as a result of class struggle, making it scientific, not as a result of utopian thinking and just a desire for better action. And he defines socialism as the means of production being controlled by society, and production no longer being organized around profits, but rational planning of the economy leading toward the ultimate goal of communism. So Friedrich Engels' definition of socialism, and that has stuck. I mean, many people have noted that Gaddafi's Green Book, a lot of the passages from it are very much inspired by Friedrich Engels, that Ba'athist Arab socialism uses that definition, African socialism uses that definition, that public control of the means of production. That is the definition of socialism that's stuck, right? For the most part. Okay. So on that note, folks, it's been fun. We've had a great chat here. Happy Saturday. I've still got a little bit of unnamed diet beverage left. And I think we're going to wrap it up. But ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers, thank you, CJR, a new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And don't forget, we need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. Good night.